It is the question no one asks anymore because everyone assumes they know the answer. How did the machine that built America, that connected coast to coast, that rumbled through the dreams of every child who ever watched the rails, vanish in just 20 years? Once 60,000 steam locomotives pulled passenger trains across 265,000 miles of track, their whistles echoing through every town, their smoke visible for miles, their arrival setting the clocks of the nation. Today, those same machines sit silent in museums, polished relics behind velvet ropes, while sleek diesel units glide past without ceremony or soul. And the real reason reveals a collision of physics, economics, and a transformation so complete that an entire way of life disappeared before most people noticed it was dying. So why did steam passenger trains actually disappear? The answer starts not with their failure, but with their impossible promise. On a cold morning in January 1831, a conductor named John B. Jervis stood beside a primitive steam engine called the DeWitt Clinton on the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad near Albany, New York. The locomotive weighed just 7 tons, burned wood instead of coal, and could barely manage 20 miles per hour with 3 passenger cars trailing behind. Sparks flew from its smokestack, setting fire to the clothing of passengers riding in open carriages. The cars had no springs, so every rail joint sent a jarring shock through the wooden benches. Brakes were virtually non-existent, but none of that mattered to the crowds that gathered trackside rough. They had just watched a machine powered by fire and water move faster than any horse, faster than anything human hands had ever built. Jervis called it the future. What he had witnessed was the birth of an obsession that would reshape the continent. At first, these early steam locomotives were little more than experiments on wheels, temperamental beasts that required constant feeding and frequent repairs. Engineers learned, through disasters, each explosion or derailment teaching hard lessons about boiler pressure, wheel arrangement, and the physics of adhesion. Rail traffic grew and passenger demand multiplied. By the 1850s, railroads like the Pennsylvania and the New York Central were commissioning dedicated passenger locomotives, machines designed not just to haul, but to race, to impress, to claim speed records and steal customers from rival lines. The locomotives evolved with stunning speed. 4-wheel engines gave way to 8-wheel designs. Simple valve gear became compound expansion systems. Wood fuel turned to coal, then to carefully graded anthracite that burned hotter and cleaner. A breakthrough came in 1893 when the New York Central unveiled its 9999 locomotive, a gleaming 4-cylinder engine that allegedly reached 112 miles per hour pulling the Empire State Express. From the cab, the engineer could feel the entire machine strain against the physics of friction and inertia, every moving part, synchronized in a symphony of controlled violence. The design quickly became standard, turning the steam passenger locomotive into a kind of performance art on rails. By the 1920s, new locomotives rolled out of shops with massive driving wheels, 7 feet tall, streamlined shrouds that sliced through wind resistance, and roller bearings that reduced friction to near nothing. Their signature shapes became instantly recognizable across the country. Inside the cab, engineers monitored steam pressure gauges, water glass levels, and the color of the fire, adjusting throttle and cutoff with the precision of concert pianists. Firemen shoveled 10 tons of coal per shift, building fires that could boil water at 300 pounds per square inch, temperatures hot enough to glow through the firebox doors. Each railroad painted their passenger locomotives in bold liveries. Tuscan red for Pennsylvania, two-tone gray for New York Central, deep green for Southern, chrome and crimson for Santa Fe. Turning the locomotive into a moving billboard and a promise to anyone waiting on station platforms. Every design change, from the first crude wood burner to the streamlined giants of the 1940s, answered a single need: move passengers faster, run longer distances without stopping, and give the railroad a way to prove its superiority over every competitor on parallel tracks. By 1920, steam had reached its zenith. Nearly 60,000 steam locomotives operated on American rails, and 2/3 of them pulled passenger trains at least part of the time. Entire towns existed solely to service them. Roundhouses in Altoona, Pennsylvania employed 3,000 workers. Coal towers, water tanks, and ash pits dotted the landscape every 100 miles. The rhythm of passenger steam ruled American time itself. Pocket watches were set by the arrival of the 3:15 express. Families planned their weeks around the Sunday excursion train. Children counted the passenger cars and waved at the engineer leaning from his cab window. But even as steam reached this peak of power and cultural dominance, three invisible forces were already plotting its destruction. The first had nothing to do with competing technology. It was hidden in the ledgers, buried in maintenance reports, and written in the broken bodies of men who fed the fire. And once the railroads started counting the real cost, nothing could stop what came next. The problem was not performance, it was everything else. In 1940, the Pennsylvania Railroad's accounting department published an internal study that would never see public distribution, but would change the future of American transportation. The report documented the true cost of operating a single K4's Pacific-class passenger locomotive for 1 year. The numbers were staggering, and they told a story that no amount of romance or tradition could overcome. Every steam passenger locomotive required a minimum of 9 people to keep it moving. The engineer and fireman rode in the cab, but behind them stretched an invisible army. Coal handlers worked around the clock filling tenders at terminals. Ash cleaners shoveled out fireboxes still hot enough to melt boots. Boiler inspectors crawled inside drums looking for cracks and scale buildup. Roundhouse mechanics replaced worn bearings, repacked valve stems, and hammered out bent side rods. Hostlers moved locomotives between tracks, keeping the roundhouse flowing. Water service workers maintained towers and treated boiler feed to prevent mineral deposits. For every hour a locomotive spent pulling passengers, 3 men spent an hour keeping it alive. The fireman's job was the most brutal. A typical run from New York to Chicago covered 900 miles and required 12 hours in the cab. During that shift, a fireman shoveled between 8 and 12 tons of coal, 1 shovelful every 30 seconds, maintaining a fire that turned the cab into a furnace. Temperatures at the firebox door reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit even in winter. The work destroyed backs, shoulders, and knees. Most firemen developed permanent injuries by age 40, and few lasted beyond 50. The engineer might ride in relative comfort, but the fireman paid in flesh for every mile. Then there was the infrastructure. A steam locomotive could travel roughly 100 miles before needing water and 150 miles before running low on coal. This meant the railroads had to maintain water towers, coal tipples, and servicing facilities at intervals across every route. A single water tower cost $15,000 to build in 1940 and required constant maintenance to prevent freezing in winter. Coal tipples needed conveyor systems, storage bunkers, and their own teams of workers. Ash pits had to be excavated regularly, the waste hauled away by the ton. Turntables were essential because steam locomotives could not run efficiently in reverse for long distances, and each turntable represented a major capital investment and maintenance headache. The locomotives themselves spent more time being serviced than earning revenue. Pennsylvania Railroad's data showed that for every 6 hours of road service, a steam passenger locomotive required 18 hours of inspection, cleaning, fueling, watering, and repair. The ratio was relentless. A diesel unit could run for days without stopping. Steam had to pause, had to breathe, had to be fed and cleaned like a living thing. But the cruelest reality was thermal efficiency. Coal contains roughly 12,000 British thermal units of energy per pound. When burned in a locomotive firebox, the heat boiled water into steam at pressures up to 300 pounds per square inch. That steam expanded through cylinders, pushing pistons that turned driving wheels. At each stage of this process, energy bled away as waste heat. The firebox radiated warmth into the air. The boiler lost heat through its jacket. The cylinders exhausted steam that still contained usable energy. The wheels slipped against rails, converting motion into friction and sound. By the time the coal's energy reached the rail, only 6 to 8% remained as useful work. A steam passenger locomotive burning 100 pounds of coal per mile was converting 98 pounds of that coal into expensive smoke and heat that vanished into the atmosphere. The Pennsylvania Railroad study calculated the operating cost at $2.73 per locomotive mile in 1940. This included fuel, water, labor, maintenance, and infrastructure amortization. Their projection for diesel-electric locomotives, still largely theoretical for passenger service, came to $1.85 per mile. Across millions of annual miles, the difference is measured in tens of millions of dollars every year, but even these crushing costs could not kill steam alone. It took a machine that seemed impossible and a war that made it essential. The diesel engine was invented in 1893 by a German engineer named Rudolf Diesel, but for 40 years, almost no one thought it. Belonged on a railroad. The engines were too heavy, too slow, and too weak to replace steam. Then in the 1920s, a brilliant engineer named Charles Kettering at General Motors saw something everyone else had missed. He realized you did not need the diesel engine to turn the wheels directly. Instead, the diesel could spin an electric generator, and that generator could power electric motors attached to each axle. No complex valve gear, no side rods, no steam, just controlled electricity flowing to wheels that could grip rails with perfect traction. General Motors formed the Electromotive Division in 1930 to build this new kind of locomotive. For 4 years, they tested and failed and rebuilt. Then on May 26, 1934, they were ready to prove everything. The Burlington Railroad agreed to let them run a single test. A sleek stainless steel train called the Zephyr would attempt to run from Denver to Chicago nonstop, covering 1,015 miles faster than any steam train had ever managed the route. The Zephyr left Denver at dawn. Inside, a diesel engine hummed quietly, spinning a generator that fed electricity to traction motors. No firemen shoveled coal, no water towers interrupted the run, no coal stops broke the rhythm. The engineer simply adjusted a throttle and watched the speedometer climb. Across Colorado, Nebraska, and Iowa, the Zephyr ran like nothing America had ever seen. It averaged 77 miles per hour for the entire distance, reaching speeds above 100 miles per hour on flat stretches. 13 hours and 5 minutes after leaving Denver, it rolled into Chicago to crowds that could barely believe what they were witnessing. A train had just crossed 3 states without stopping once for fuel or water. The technology was elegant in its simplicity. The diesel engine burned fuel oil, not coal, so there was no ash, no smoke, no flying sparks. It ran at a constant speed, always in its most efficient range, spinning the generator smoothly. The electricity went directly to motors mounted on the trucks beneath the train, delivering instant power to every driving wheel. There was no slipping, no lost energy in complex linkages, no steam condensing wastefully in cold air. The system converted 30% of the fuel's energy into motion at the rails, nearly 5 times better than steam's 6%. But the Zephyr was a lightweight passenger train, and the railroads needed proof that diesel could pull heavy freight and long passenger consists. World War II provided that proof by accident. In 1941, America entered the war and suddenly needed thousands of reliable locomotives to move troops and supplies. The military demanded diesel switchers for shipyards and freight yards because they could start and stop instantly, run for days without maintenance, and operate in any weather without freezing. Electromotive built over 1,000 diesel locomotives during the war years, while the old steam builders like Baldwin and Lima were locked into producing conventional steam power for domestic railroads. By 1945, when the war ended, something crucial had happened. Railroads had been forced to learn diesel maintenance. Mechanics who had spent their careers working on steam boilers now understood electric generators and traction motors. Diesel fuel distribution networks existed at major terminals. Most importantly, the military diesel locomotives had proven themselves absolutely reliable under brutal conditions, running in North African deserts and Pacific Island jungles without the constant feeding and watering that steam demanded. Then came the final advantage that made steam obsolete. Diesel locomotives could operate in multiple units. 3 diesel engines, each with its own engineer, could be controlled from a single cab, delivering 6,000 horsepower as one perfectly synchronized machine. To match that power with steam required 10 separate locomotives and 20 crew members. The math was not even close. The technology existed. The reliability was proven. The economics were undeniable, but steam still had one last defender, and it was not the railroads. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen knew exactly what diesel meant for their members. Every diesel passenger locomotive eliminated one fireman's job. Across America, 40,000 firemen faced unemployment if the railroads converted completely. In 1950, the Union drew a line. They demanded that diesel locomotives pulling passenger trains still carry a fireman, even though the diesel required no coal shoveling, no fire tending, no boiler watching. The railroads refused. Strikes shut down major passenger routes for weeks. Arbitration boards sided with the railroads, ruling that diesel operation required only an engineer. The firemen had lost, but the human cost went far beyond union halls and arbitration rulings. Entire towns had been built around steam passenger service, their economies completely dependent on the rituals of servicing and maintaining locomotives. Altoona, Pennsylvania was home to the Pennsylvania Railroad's massive Juniata shops, where 15,000 workers built and rebuilt steam locomotives. The roundhouse could service 50 locomotives simultaneously. The erecting shop stretched for nearly a quarter mile. Men walked to work past rows of passenger engines being stripped down to their frames, boilers lifted by overhead cranes, driving wheels removed for turning on massive lathes. Roanoke, Virginia existed almost entirely because of Norfolk and Western's East End shops, employing 5,000 workers building the railroad's distinctive passenger power. When diesels arrived, these towns collapsed almost overnight. Diesel locomotives needed no roundhouses, no daily servicing, no armies of specialists. A diesel could run for a month on basic maintenance that took hours instead of days. Altoona's population dropped from 82,000 in 1950 to 69,000 by 1960 as the shops closed entire buildings and laid off thousands. The downtown, businesses that had served shop workers for generations shuttered their doors. Roanoke watched its tax base evaporate as Norfolk and Western quietly began replacing its passenger steam fleet. Even as disaster spread through these steam towns, a few railroads refused to surrender. Norfolk and Western doubled down on coal power, arguing that a railroad hauling coal from Appalachian mines should burn coal in its locomotives. In 1952, while every other major railroad was ordering diesels, N&W built new Y6B class mallet locomotives, massive articulated engines designed specifically for the railroad's demanding mountain passenger runs. The railroad's executives published studies showing that on their system, burning their own coal, steam could compete with diesel economics. But even Norfolk and Western's accountants could not ignore the numbers forever. In 1955, the railroad calculated that diesel operation cut costs by 45% compared to steam. The coal they hauled might be cheap, but the labor, the water, the maintenance infrastructure, and the sheer complexity of steam operations could not be overcome by free fuel. The symbolic moment came in 1953. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest steam operator in America, the company that had refined steam passenger power to its absolute peak, placed an order for 500 diesel locomotives. The order included 0 steam engines. It was a public execution of a technology that had built the railroad's empire. 2 years later, Baldwin Locomotive Works, builder of steam engines since 1831, announced it was exiting the locomotive market entirely. There were no buyers left for steam. Tradition had lost. Economics had won. But the final death of steam passenger service required one more force, and it came from outside the railroads entirely. By 1955, American cities had endured decades of coal smoke from locomotives, factories, and home furnaces. The air in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis was thick enough to taste. City councils began passing smoke abatement ordinances with real teeth. Steam locomotives emitted roughly 10 pounds of coal particulates per mile of operation, visible as black clouds that settled on buildings and streets. Chicago's new regulations imposed fines of $500 per violation. Railroads running steam passenger trains through urban terminals faced thousands of dollars in daily penalties. Diesel exhaust was cleaner by 90%, producing mostly invisible emissions that inspectors could not easily measure or prosecute. Then came the fire liability. Steam locomotives threw sparks from their smokestacks with every mile. In dry seasons, these sparks ignited trackside grass, wooden structures, and stored materials. Insurance industry data from 1957 documented over 8,000 fires annually caused by steam locomotive operations, costing railroads more than $12 million in legal settlements and property damage claims. Insurance companies responded by tripling premiums for any railroad still operating steam passenger service. Diesel locomotives produced zero spark emissions. The fire risk disappeared completely. The Interstate Commerce Commission watched passenger rail revenues collapse through the 1950s as highways and airlines stole customers. In 1958, the ICC published a comprehensive study examining why passenger trains were dying. The conclusion was direct. Steam's higher operating costs made passenger service unprofitable on most routes. Diesel could reduce costs enough to potentially save passenger rail, but only if railroads converted their entire fleets and eliminated the dual infrastructure burden of supporting both technologies. Railroads seized on this finding to justify discontinuing steam passenger routes entirely, arguing they were complying with federal guidance to modernize or abandon service. But perhaps the final incompatibility was the most subtle. Modern railroad signaling systems and centralized traffic control required predictable, consistent locomotive performance. Dispatchers needed to know exactly how quickly a train could accelerate from a stop or brake from speed. Steam power varied constantly depending on boiler pressure, coal quality, the skill of the fireman, even the weather affecting steam condensation. Two identical steam locomotives on the same route could perform completely differently on different days. Diesel power was utterly standardized. Every unit of the same model produced identical horsepower, identical braking performance, identical acceleration curves. The new computerized dispatching systems being installed in the late 1950s could calculate train movements to the minute, but only if every locomotive behaved predictably. Steam's variability made it incompatible with automation. By 1960, steam was not just expensive, it was illegal in major cities, uninsurable on main lines, unwelcome in federal transportation policy, and incompatible with modern train control systems. The technology that had ruled American rails for 130 years had become obsolete, not through a single failure, but through 1,000 small incompatibilities with the world that had grown up around it. Only one question remained. Who would operate the very last steam passenger train? Norfolk and Western Railroad held out longer than anyone expected. Through 1959, the railroad's premier passenger train, the Powhatan Arrow, still thundered between Norfolk and Cincinnati behind a Class J Northern locomotive, one of the most beautiful steam engines ever built. But even Norfolk and Western could not resist forever. In May 1959, the Powhatan Arrow made its final steam-powered run. Photographers lined the tracks. Elderly engineers who had fired those same locomotives 40 years earlier stood watching from platforms. The whistle echoed one last time through the Virginia mountains, and then it was gone. Canadian Pacific operated the last major steam passenger service in North America, finally, converting to diesel in June 1960. A few smaller railroads continued sporadic steam operations into 1961, but these were farewell tours, not regular service. By December 1961, when Norfolk and Western dieselized its remaining freight operations, the era was officially over. No Class I railroad in America operated steam locomotives in regular service anymore. The accounting departments calculated the final victory. Diesel saved an average of $381 per train day in direct operating costs compared to steam. Across all major railroads, this translated to roughly $450 million in annual savings by 1965. Maintenance facilities that had numbered 2,500 in the steam era dropped to just 400 diesel shops. Crew sizes were cut in half. Water towers were demolished. Roundhouses were abandoned or converted to diesel servicing bays. Coal tipples fell silent, but the human cost was staggering. Between 1945 and 1965, American railroads eliminated 120,000 jobs. Firemen, coal handlers, boiler, inspectors, hostlers, and roundhouse mechanics found their skills worthless in the diesel age. Towns built entirely around steam servicing watched their economies collapse. The transition was efficient, economical, and utterly ruthless. The switch to diesel did not save passenger rail. Rittership continued its collapse through the 1960s as interstate highways and jet aircraft offered speed and convenience that no train could match. By 1971, most railroads had abandoned passenger service entirely, forcing the federal government to create Amtrak to preserve what little remained. Diesel locomotives pulled these trains efficiently and quietly, but they never captured the public imagination. The soul had gone out of rail travel and diesel's sterile efficiency could not bring it back. Today, roughly 200 preserved steam locomotives exist in operating condition, maintained by tourist railroads and historical societies. They require special permits, extensive liability insurance, and coal that must be sourced through specialty suppliers. Regular operation under modern regulations is essentially impossible. The engines run on summer weekends for enthusiasts, pulling short excursion trains at regulated speeds, shadows of what they once were. The diesel locomotive was more efficient, more reliable, more economical. It was superior in every way that accountants could measure, but efficiency does not wave to children. Reliability does not shake the ground. Economy does not burn with visible fire. We gained predictability and lost spectacle. We traded romance for schedules, poetry for spreadsheets. And the question remains, echoing like a distant whistle through the years. What else are we replacing right now that our grandchildren will only know from museums? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. See you on the next one.